They say the perfect wedding is a fairy tale. But for the Clark family, it was a crime scene waiting to happen. Welcome to the Tea Vault. I'm spilling the story of a perfect family whose deepest secrets were exposed in a single scandalous day. If you love deep dive family drama, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Tea Vault so you don't miss the next story. Now, let's see how it all fell apart.
The Caribbean sun beat down on the kitchen tiles, intensifying the heat already radiating from my mother, Gloria. She watched me with a hawk-like intensity, her eyes lingering on the single plate I had just rinsed and placed in the rack. She didn't see the clean dish, she saw a moral failing. The air felt thick, heavy with the unspoken demand that I be anyone other than myself. Keesha's name hung in the room like a ghost. It was the yardstick by which my entire existence was measured, a standard I had long ago stopped trying to reach. While I was painted as the restless wanderer, the one who traded stability for the salt air of the beach and the uncertainty of my art, Keesha was the polished diamond. She was the accountant, the fiancée, the trophy daughter who kept her dishes dry and her life tucked neatly into boxes. By the time the evening rolled around, the living room had become a shrine to the upcoming wedding. The house was littered with thick, cream-colored invitations and floral swatches that matched the meticulous vision my mother had curated. My father, David, sat in his armchair, a silent mediator who preferred peace to the truth, while Keesha moved through the space with a forced, fragile grace. I sat on the edge of the sofa, feeling like a discordant note in a symphony that was meant to be flawless. Later that night, the contrast between our lives felt even sharper. I found my way to the local rum shop, the familiar stinging burn of the liquor offering a momentary reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere at home. My friend Samantha was there, her sharp intuition cutting through the haze. She didn't just see my frustration, she saw the cracks in the facade I had been observing all day. She mentioned Leroy, the groom, and how his usual veneer of stability had begun to flicker with a strange, frantic tension. When I snuck into Keesha's room later, the truth felt closer, humming in the quiet space. She jumped when I entered, her hands fumbling to hide a stack of papers that looked far too worn to be wedding plans. The perfection she projected was thinner than she wanted to admit. As I retreated to my own room, the weight of the secret I felt brewing in the house felt heavier than ever. The next morning, the cycle began again on the veranda. The scent of coffee and the gentle island breeze couldn't mask the underlying acidity of my mother's voice. She wanted a reflection of her own pride, not a daughter who dared to live outside the lines. I looked at the horizon, realizing that the facade they were building, the wedding, the status, the perfect family, was a house of cards. I was the disappointment, because I was the only one who could see that the foundation was already rotting from the inside out.
The wedding boutique was a whirlwind of tulle and suffocating expectation. My mother, Gloria, was in her element, her eyes beaming as she appraised the gown draped over Keesha. To me, it looked like a giant, overpriced cupcake, but to my mother, it was a symbol of everything she deemed correct. I tried to voice my discomfort, but my words were brushed aside as mere interference, a pathetic attempt to puncture the balloon of her manufactured perfection. Every time I questioned the budget or the aesthetic, the air in the room grew colder, as if my very presence was an affront to the royal script being written. Later that evening, the venue garden, a lush, manicured space that cost more than a year of my own earnings, became the stage for a different kind of performance. Leroy and Keesha stood in the shadow of a blooming hibiscus, the romantic ambience stripped away by the raw, biting tension between them. Leroy's usual veneer of stability was fraying, his voice strained as he questioned the mounting costs. Keesha, however, was a statue of forced resolute, doubling down on the wedding of her dreams, despite the visible tremors in his hands. It was the first time I realized the cracks weren't just in my mother's plans, they were in the foundation of the union itself. Dinner that night at the family table was an exercise in performative normalcy. Gloria played the conductor, managing all movements and moods with an iron hand, while I navigated the familiar minefield of her disapproval. Every interaction felt choreographed. When Leroy arrived, his charm felt mechanical, his smile barely touching his eyes as he navigated the small talk with my father. He was a man holding on to a secret with a white-knuckled grip, and the intensity of it was palpable. The night ended in the quiet, stifling air outside Keesha's bedroom. When I pressed her, my intuition screaming that something fundamentally was wrong, she retreated behind a wall of defensiveness, her phone clutched like a lifeline. She saw my concern as an invasion, a desperate grab for gossip, but she didn't see the fear behind my eyes. She was hiding something, and the frantic way she pushed me away only confirmed my suspicions. By the next afternoon, the veranda felt like a pressure cooker. My father tried to mediate, but the air was thick with the weight of impending collapse. When Leroy arrived to check on his bride, his greeting to the family was a hollow echo of the man he was supposed to be. As I watched him ascend the stairs, I realized that the wedding wasn't just a ceremony anymore. It was a ticking clock, and the countdown was moving faster than any of them dared to acknowledge.
The pressure in the house was no longer just a hum, it was a roar. The wedding countdown had reached a fever pitch, and the cracks in the facade were widening into fissures that even my mother couldn't ignore. The day started in the kitchen, a place that usually smelled of coffee and morning routines, but today it smelled like an ambush. A thick cream-colored envelope had arrived in the morning post, not an invitation, but something far more ominous. I watched my mother's face as she turned the paper over, her composure fracturing. She didn't say a word, just tucked it into her apron pocket with a trimmer in her hands that I had never seen before. When I asked her about it, the snap of her voice was sharp enough to cut through the stillness of the room. By noon, the atmosphere had spilled out onto the patio. I caught glimpses of hushed, frantic phone calls being made from behind the garden shed. It wasn't just Leroy who was acting strangely anymore, it was the whole dynamic. The perfect family unit was starting to look like a group of conspirators waiting for a bomb to go off. I kept my distance, playing the part of the disappointment of the family, but my eyes were everywhere. I noticed the way my father avoided eye contact with the neighbors, the way the gardener seemed to be listening rather than weeding, and the way Keesha refused to come out of her room at all. Then came the moment of the first major reveal. I had ducked into the home office to grab a book when I heard them, my mother and a woman I'd never seen before, their voices low and sharp in the dim light. They weren't talking about floral arrangements or catering menus. They were arguing about a name, a date, and a sum of money that made my heart stop. I pressed my back against the wall, listening as the perfect sister's reputation was dismantled in a few jagged, whispered sentences. It wasn't just a wedding secret, it was a legacy of deception. The weight of what I had heard felt heavy, almost suffocating. As I walked out into the bright Caribbean sunlight, everything looked exactly the same, yet it was fundamentally broken. The lilies, the pristine terrace, the laughter of the guests arriving for a pre-wedding cocktail hour, it was all a mask. I looked at the house, then at my sister's window, and realized that the disappointment of the family was actually the only person who knew exactly how hard this house was about to fall. The truth was out there now, floating in the humid air, and there was no turning back.
The air in the marketplace was thick, not just with the scent of roasted spices and sea salt, but with the sharp, acidic tang of rumors. Everywhere I turned, the wedding was the only topic of conversation. Samantha caught me by the spice stall, her eyes wide with the kind of frantic energy that told me the whispers had reached a boiling point. We weren't just talking about a wedding anymore, we were talking about a social detonation. I told her about the birth certificate. The paper, hidden beneath my mattress, felt like it was burning a hole through the wood. It was the absolute damning evidence of Leroy's secret life, the twin children he'd managed to keep in the shadows while he played the part of the devoted groom. Samantha looked horrified, the reality of it hitting her with a physical force. She urged me to go to Keesha, but my mother's threats still echoed in my mind. She had been clear. If I interfered with the perfection of this day, I would be cut off, cast out of the only home I'd ever known. At the hair salon, the atmosphere was even worse. My mother, usually a master of composed silence, found herself surrounded by neighbors who didn't care about politeness. Their questions about Leroy's secret children hit her like physical blows. She parried their inquiries with icy denials, her face a mask of ironclad defiance, but I could see the cracks. She was desperate to keep the narrative alive, to shield the family name from the encroaching storm of truth. By evening, the gossip had found its way to the coffee shop where my father sat with Leroy. I wasn't there, but the tension that followed them home was unmistakable. David, usually the mediator, looked hollowed out. His questions about the rumors met with Leroy's practiced slippery charm. He was selling a lie, and my father was struggling to buy it. Back home, the house felt like a tomb. In the kitchen, Keesha's vulnerability finally cracked the surface. She confronted my mother, her voice trembling as she asked if her own fiancé was a liar. My mother didn't tell her the truth. She fed her another layer of the facade, smothering her daughter's fare with hollow promises of perfection. As I sat in my room, clutching my phone and staring at the stars, I knew we had reached the point of no return. Keesha was walking toward a cliff, and my mother was doing everything in her power to make sure she didn't look down. The fire was already burning. We were just waiting for the whole house to catch. The atmosphere in the house had become suffocating, a pressure cooker of unspoken truths and brittle expectations. In the backyard, the morning sun did nothing to warm the conversation between my father and LeCroy. David, usually a man of tempered patience, had reached his limit. He pressed LeCroy on the rumors swirling through the town, his voice tight with the desperate need to protect his daughter's heart. LeCroy parried the questions with the polished, practiced ease of a man who had built a career on deception. He spoke of business secrets and jealousy, offering reassurances that felt hollow like an echo in a canyon. My father walked away with a heavy heart, but the doubt had already taken root, blooming like a dark, invasive vine. Inside the house, the living room felt like a stage set for a tragedy I was watching in slow motion. Keesha sat with my mother, her presence fading into the background of her own life. She confessed to feeling like an actress in a play she hadn't auditioned for, her nerves frayed by LeCroy's cold distance. My mother, however, wouldn't allow the cracks to show. She tightened her grip on the narrative, treating Keesha's existential dread as mere wedding stress. She poured tea and demanded a smile, shielding her daughter from the reality that her perfect union was already a ghost of what it was supposed to be. I spent the afternoon in the garden, pacing the shadows and clutching my phone as if it were a talisman. Samantha's voice on the other end of the line was my only tether to sanity. She urged me to hold my fire, to wait for the ceremony, the ultimate stage, to reveal the secret that would shatter everything. The paper under my bed felt like a ticking bomb, and the silence in the house was becoming unbearable. My mother's eyes were always on me, a surveillance that made every movement feel like a tactical error. That night, in the privacy of her own room, Keesha stared at her reflection until the girl in the mirror became a stranger. She whispered the questions she was too terrified to ask aloud, grappling with the phantom of LeCroy's secret life.
She tried to convince herself that the rumors were just gossip, that the facade was strong enough to hold, but her internal monologue was a battleground. She chose to cling to the lie, terrified of what the truth would demand of her. The final act of the day played out in the kitchen, where my parents stood in the flickering light of the late-night hours. My father had finally stopped acting, his exhaustion plain as he questioned the cost of the life they had curated. My mother, however, as always, retreated into the defense of her own vanity, accusing my father of betrayal and pointing the finger at me, the disappointment who dared to look too closely. As my father walked out, leaving the weight of his words hanging in the stagnant air, it was clear. The dream was not just fragile, it was already shattered. We were all just waiting for the pieces to finish falling. The dressing room was thick with the suffocating scent of lilies and hairspray, a staging ground for a performance that was about to be cancelled. Keisha sat before the mirror, a vision in white, but her eyes held a hollow, desperate fear that no amount of foundation could mask. I burst through the doors, no longer willing to play the part of the silent disappointment. My mother, Gloria, lunged forward, a wall of fury, but the momentum had shifted. I thrust the birth certificate into Keisha's hands, a cold, damning slab of reality that cut through the haze of the morning. Keisha's face drained of color as she read the lines. The twins, the hidden life, the years of carefully constructed deception, it all collapsed in a single shivering exhale. My mother's desperate shrieks that it was all a lie fell flat against the weight of the document. For the first time, Keisha looked at her with a clarity that was more painful than any lie. She didn't scream, she simply stood, a broken doll realizing she had been dancing on a grave. Outside the church, the air was sharp with the tension of an impending storm. My father met us at the entrance, and the final mask fell away. When Keisha pressed him, the truth leaked out in small, pathetic fragments. He had known, they had all known, and they had chosen the facade over her future. The betrayal was absolute. When the reality of the deception hit her, Keisha didn't just reject the marriage, she rejected the entire foundation of her world. She stepped away from the altar, away from the expectations, and away from the life she had been forced to perform. Leroy, standing at the altar with his practiced, smug confidence, found himself confronted by David instead of a bride. It was a brutal, ugly ending to a partnership built on greed. As David ordered him out, his mask slipped, revealing the coward beneath the tailor-made suit. He fled the church, his threats echoing against the stone walls, but they were the desperate gasps of a man who had finally lost the power to deceive. Outside, the aftermath was a landscape of debris. Keisha was a ghost in white, walking away from the church steps into an uncertain, lonely horizon. I begged to follow, to shelter her, but she needed to shed the skin of her old life alone. I watched her go, a sister finally free, but utterly shattered, leaving behind the wreckage of our family's prestige. Inside the pews, the silence was absolute. My mother sat amidst the ruins of her perfect day, her grief not for her daughter, but for the status she had lost. When she looked at my father, her eyes were cold, devoid of the love that held the house together. We were no longer a family. We were just survivors standing in the rubble of a scandal that would haunt us for a lifetime.
The silence in the kitchen was more abrasive than any shouting match we'd ever had. My father, David, stood his ground as Gloria paced the floor, her rage curdling into a toxic bitterness. She clung to the shards of her broken social status like a drowning woman, lamenting the perfect future she thought she had curated for Keisha. My father finally stripped away the final layer of her denial, revealing the ugly truth. Leroy hadn't just been a secret father, he had been a parasite, bleeding my father dry for money to maintain the very illusion Gloria worshipped. The realization that our name was tarnished didn't break my father, it liberated him. He saw the respect we held in town for what it always was, a fragile shell of a life built on nothing. Down at the beach, the rhythmic crashing of the waves offered little comfort. I sat on the weathered bench, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing down on my lungs. Samantha was right, the truth wasn't wrong, but that didn't stop the loneliness from creeping in. I had saved my sister, but I had also set fire to the only home I knew. I made the decision then. I couldn't stay in that house where the air was thick with my mother's resentment. I was going to find Keesha. I was going to find a way for us to be something other than the labels we'd been forced to wear. Back at the house, the living room had become a battleground of finality. My mother's demand for silence was met with my father's quiet, devastating resolve. He refused to let her alienate me. His refusal to be intimidated sparked the final explosion. The insults she hurled at him were the last thrashing of a woman who had staked her entire existence on a lie. When my father finally walked out, he wasn't just leaving a house, he was abandoning a lifetime of performative misery, leaving my mother alone with the suffocating silence of the life she had chosen. In the anonymity of a hotel room, Keesha finally let the mask fall. The luxury of the space didn't mask her isolation. She was a girl without a history, stripped of the identity of the perfect daughter. She looked out at the lights of Barbados, seeing the island not as home, but as a cage. She made the decision that night, her resolve as cold and clear as the ocean. She was ready to run. London or anywhere far enough to bury the woman she was supposed to be. She was ready to be just Keesha, to carve out a space where the expectations of others couldn't reach her. Late that night, on the porch where I'd spent so many years feeling like a ghost, I packed the last of my things. My father joined me, his eyes mirroring my own exhaustion and, for the first time, a sense of shared purpose. We were leaving the wreckage behind, trading the hollow shell of our perfect family for the uncertain, terrifying beauty of a new start. As we stepped off the porch and into the cool, dark air of the night, I didn't look back. The past was burning, and for the first time, I felt the air moving freely around me. We were finally, truly leaving the house of cards.
The airport was a chaotic symphony of departures and reunions, but for my father and me, it felt like a hunt. We moved through the terminal with the singular focus of two people trying to catch a ghost before she vanished into the sky. When we finally spotted Keesha by the cafe, my heart stuttered, not just because we had found her, but because of who was sitting across from her. It was the woman from the office, the one who had brought the scandal to our doorstep. But she didn't look like an enemy anymore. She looked like a survivor. As we approached, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into a brutal, sharp focus. Beside the woman sat two children, small and quiet, their presence the final, undeniable proof of Leroy's monstrous deception. He hadn't just been cheating, he had been living a parallel life, holding two families hostage with his lies. Sarah, his real wife, spoke with the weary, hollowed-out tone of a woman who had finally been set free. When Keesha introduced us, the gravity of it hit me. We were all victims of the same man, our lives collateral damage in his pursuit of a hollow, manufactured prestige. The journey back to the house felt like returning to a crime scene. Keesha's decision to come back with us was fragile, a tentative olive branch offered in the wake of the truth. When we walked through the front door, the silence of the house, once oppressive, now felt different. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a space that had been scrubbed clean. My mother, Gloria, stood in the center of the living room, a shadow of the woman who had once commanded the space with such iron-fisted certainty. The confrontation that followed wasn't fueled by the explosive, performative rage of the past. It was quiet, grounded, and terrifyingly honest. When we told her about Sarah and the children, the last of my mother's armor shattered. She didn't lash out. She collapsed into the truth of her own complicity, the crushing weight of having prioritized the idea of a perfect life over the reality of her own daughter's safety.
For the first time, we weren't a cast of characters performing for an invisible audience. We were just people in a room, stripped of the status and the secrets that had defined us. It will take a lifetime to rebuild what was broken, and the scars of the last few weeks are etched deep into the foundation of who we are. But as we stood there, surrounded by the quiet of a house that finally felt like a home, there was a tentative sense of peace. We had survived the fire, and in the ashes, we were finally, for the first time, allowed to be real.
The morning light filtered into the kitchen, catching the dust motes dancing in the air, but the peaceful veneer of our new beginning shattered the moment Leroy burst through the door. He wasn't the broken man we had seen at the airport. He was a cornered animal, desperate and venomous. When he leveled his accusations at my father, the air in the room grew heavy with the scent of old, rotting secrets. David's defense was immediate, but the flicker of panic in his eyes was unmistakable. Leroy wasn't just throwing stones, he was bringing down the entire structure of our lives. The living room became the stage for the final brutal deconstruction of our family. Leroy tossed a thick file onto the coffee table, evidence of embezzlement, stolen funds, and backdoor dealings that painted my father not as the protective patriarch, but as a silent partner in the very corruption Leroy had weaponized. My mother stood frozen, her eyes darting between the man she had loved and the documents that proved he was a stranger. The word perfect felt like a slur now, a hollow mockery of the crimes that had funded our lifestyle. When David finally confessed, not out of contrition, but out of the sheer exhaustion of holding up the facade, it wasn't just his reputation that died, it was our trust. In the hallway, the realization hit us with the force of a physical blow. The irony was suffocating. My father, who had preached integrity and status, had been tied to Leroy's criminal machinery all along.
They were two sides of the same counterfeit coin. My mother, Gloria, looked as though she had aged a decade in a single afternoon, the vanity that had once defined her posture collapsing into a portrait of absolute hollow defeat. Leroy watched us, a cruel smile playing on his lips, relishing the sight of our perfect world finally succumbing to the decay he had helped sow. By evening, the house felt like a tomb of our own making. I sat on the veranda, the cool night air biting at my skin as I spoke to Samantha. There was no more mystery to uncover, no more hidden depths to plumb. The truth had arrived, and it was uglier than anything I had feared. I knew then that I couldn't remain in the wreckage. The house was not a home. It was a testament to the lies we had all helped maintain, and I needed to shed it like a second skin. Under the cover of darkness, I packed my things, and to my surprise, Keesha appeared, her own bag slung over her shoulder. The silence between us was profound, a shared recognition that our ties to the past had been severed by the weight of the truth. When we stood in the driveway, looking back at the darkened windows where our parents stood, we weren't being cruel. We were being honest for the first time in our lives. We left the house to the people who had built it, walking away from the ruins and into the vast, uncertain night. The past was truly dead, and for the first time, we were finally, terrifyingly free. The morning sun that filtered through the living room windows felt different today. Harsher, perhaps, but cleaner. The suffocating stillness of the house was replaced by the cold, biting clarity of reality. My father, David, stood by the window, no longer the master of a crumbling domain, but a man finally stripped of his armor. He and my mother, Gloria, moved through the room with a strange, quiet dignity. The image of the perfect family had finally dissolved, leaving behind two people who were no longer playing parts in a play they didn't write. For the first time, there was no performative grief. There was only the raw, difficult acceptance that they had traded their lives for a mirage. They were ruined, yes, but in that ruin, they had finally found the truth. In the stark, fluorescent light of the police station, the end of the line looked exactly like I imagined it would for Leroy. He was a man drowning in his own indignation, still clutching at the straws of a perfect plan that had been dismantled by the very truth he tried to bury. When he realized my father had not only confessed, but had provided the evidence to dismantle their entire operation, the arrogance that had defined him collapsed. He was no longer the mastermind or the predator. He was just a man in a room, waiting for the walls to close in. The law didn't care about his schemes, and for the first time, his voice carried no weight. He was finished. Miles away, in a small, nondescript cafe, the world felt vast and impossibly open. Keesha and I sat together, the silence between us no longer heavy with secrets, but light with the potential of an unwritten future. We were stripped of our history, our status, and the toxic expectations that had tethered us to a life of deception. We weren't the disappointment and the perfect daughter anymore. We were just two women sitting over coffee, finally allowed to breathe the air of a world that didn't demand we be anything other than ourselves. Back at the old house, Gloria moved through the rooms like a spirit haunting her own past. She packed the remnants of a life that had been built on prestige. Each box she closed a final, definitive period on a chapter of lies. As she walked out the door, the house, the site of so many years of curated misery, didn't look like a castle anymore. It looked like a cage she had finally unlocked.
She wasn't leaving behind a legacy. She was escaping it. The perfect family was dead, and as she stepped out into the evening air, she felt the first terrifying stirrings of a life that was finally her own. By nightfall, in a city where no one knew our names, Keesha and I stood on a balcony overlooking a landscape of endless twinkling lights. The world looked different from here. It was big, it was chaotic, and it was entirely ours. We had survived the storm that had threatened to erase us, and we had come out on the other side with nothing but the truth. There were no more roles to play, no more secrets to guard, and no more illusions to maintain. For the first time, we were simply existing. And as we stepped out into the night to explore a city that held no memories, I knew that this simple, beautiful freedom was the only perfection we would ever need.